He only wanted one night of shelter. A tired rancher with no home, no horse, and no plans walked into a remote town looking for rest in an empty barn. But when two single mothers offered him warmth and a seat by the fire, with no suspicion, no questions, he stayed. The stew was hot, the kids were watching, and something didn't feel right. By morning, he'd face local enforcers, a child's question, and a truth that would quietly pull him into the one place he didn't know he'd been searching for: a family. Before we dive in, tell us in comments where in the world you are watching from. The wind pushed against him like it had a grudge, dragging dust through the fold of his coat and into his mouth. But he didn't flinch. He'd run out of flinching months ago. His boots, cracked and split at the sides, dragged over the half-frozen trail leading into the edge of a town that didn't even have a name carved on a sign. It didn't need one. It looked like every other fringe-of-nowhere settlement. A crooked saloon, a boarding house with half its shingles missing, and chimneys smoking like nothing had changed in years. The rancher didn't come to change anything. He just needed one night, one roof, one dry spot to breathe without coughing up road dust and sorrow. His horse had given out 4 miles back. He hadn't had a full meal in 3 days. But none of that showed in his eyes. Not pride exactly, more like the absence of self-pity. There was a kind of dignity in that quiet surrender, the kind that didn't ask for help but wouldn't spit on it if it came. He carried only his satchel, slung low on his shoulder like it was filled with stones, not supplies, and a rifle wrapped in canvas. He hadn't spoken in hours. Words cost energy, and he'd learned, long ago, that silence didn't betray you the way conversation could. He passed the tavern without stopping, though the firelight inside pulled at him like a memory he didn't trust. Too many eyes, too many questions. He followed the fading lantern light down an alley, toward a barn that didn't look locked. He wasn't planning to steal, just rest. He didn't expect warmth, not even from the hay. Just enough shelter from the bitter edge of the wind. Behind him, the hills darkened. Coyotes called across the brush like ghosts sharing news. He moved quietly, like a man who knew how not to wake dogs or drunks. One more night. That was all he needed. One night, and he'd move on. But just as his hand touched the rough edge of the barn door, a voice, low, cautious, and female, broke the stillness. It wasn't fear in her tone. It was warning. And in that instant, without understanding why, the rancher felt something shift. Not outside, but deep in the bone-tired place inside him that had long stopped believing anything unexpected could still happen. The barn door hadn't creaked, but somehow she'd heard him. A woman stepped from the shadows with a lantern raised. Not high, but enough to catch his face in its trembling halo. She didn't scream or reach for a weapon. Just watched him for a beat too long, like she'd been expecting someone but wasn't sure it was him. Before he could speak, another voice joined Hayes from behind. A second woman, younger, holding a child on her hip. Her tone was steadier, practiced, as if she'd said the same line before. If you're cold, you're welcome to come inside. He hesitated, unsure if it was a joke. It wasn't. They moved aside, not inviting exactly, just opening a door that didn't usually open for men like him. Inside the cabin, the contrast was jarring. Lamplight flickered against soft blankets, wooden bowls steamed on a small table, and the smell of lentils and smoked meat nearly brought him to his knees. A second child peeked out from behind a curtain, eyes wide. He didn't ask questions, didn't reach for his satchel, just removed his hat, nodded his thanks, and stepped in slow, like a man unsure if he was walking into kindness or trap. The women exchanged a glance, quick and quiet. Their smiles never faltered, but something underneath felt timed, choreographed. The food, the warmth, the welcome, it all came too easily. And for the first time in months, he wasn't sure what he'd walked into. He sat near the hearth, the warmth crawling slowly into his bones like it had to convince them first. His hands hovered over the flame, not reaching, just remembering. The older of the two women stirred the pot without looking at him, but he could feel her attention in the quiet. The younger one rocked the baby with a rhythm that felt more like thinking than soothing. No one asked him where he came from. No one asked his name. They only asked if he'd eat. That alone unsettled him. Hospitality without suspicion was rare. In his world, no one gave anything without measuring the cost. Hey, the cost was invisible, but present. The children crept closer, silent but watching, as if waiting for something in him to appear, something he wasn't sure he still had. He noticed the way the older woman nodded subtly when the younger spoke, as if signaling approval. Every sentence between them felt trimmed, cautious, rehearsed. Not fearful, but deliberate. He knew how people acted when they'd been burned before. This house had seen harm. He recognized the effort it took to keep things calm. His presence had bent the air slightly, like a gust that unsettles but doesn't yet knock things over. They were measuring him, not for threat, not for goodness, but for something deeper, unspoken. And though the food filled his belly and the warmth touched his skin, he knew shelter like this didn't come free. Not truly. He just didn't know yet what debt he'd walked into. The fire had burned low before either woman spoke of anything real. The air had thickened with unsaid things. Tension coiled in the quiet between spoon scrapes and crackling logs. Then, with a glance exchanged, like they'd agreed long ago what night it would be, the older one spoke. Not soft, not hard. Just steady. "We didn't take you in because we're kind," she said. "We took you in because we're alone." Her eyes didn't ask for pity. They stated facts. The younger woman didn't flinch, just held her baby tighter, as if bracing for the rest. "When there's no man on this land, we're fair game," she added. "For taxes we don't owe. For favors we never asked. For men who think law's just what you can get away with." The rancher looked between them, and for the first time, he realized the weight wasn't just in their words. It was in the way they carried the room, like every beam and brick might betray them if they stopped holding it up. "But when there's a man," the older one continued, "even a quiet one, even just present, the world backs off a little." Then came the question, simple but brutal in its clarity. "Will you stay? Just for a while. Not to fight, not to pretend, but to be seen." The room fell silent again, but it wasn't the same silence. It was the kind that waits for something to break. The rancher felt the ground shift beneath his ribs, not from fear of danger, but from fear of failing again, of being someone's hope and not holding up. The knock was soft but not friendly. It came with the kind of silence that made your gut tighten before your mind caught up. The rancher hadn't yet answered the women's request, hadn't decided what kind of man he was willing to become again, but time didn't care. Two figures stood on the porch when the door opened, dressed like local officials but speaking like opportunists. Their words were pleasant in tone, but not in purpose. "Just checking on things," the older one said, his eyes skipping over the rancher and landing on the women like he owned the ground under their feet. "Didn't know you had company." The pause was calculated, the message clear. The younger woman's posture shifted, small but familiar, like muscle memory from 100 conversations she didn't want to have. The older woman stepped forward to block the view of the children. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that cost something. The rancher stood quietly, still by the fire, but his presence now hung in the room like a drawn bowstring. This was what they meant. This is what they lived with. A world that questioned them on sight, pushed at their walls to find weakness. He hadn't planned to speak, hadn't planned to belong. But then the official addressed him directly. "You staying long?" The question carried weight. Saying nothing would have been easier, safer. But the rancher stepped forward, voice low but firm. "Long enough," he said. And in that moment, the balance in the room shifted, not loudly, but permanently. The men didn't linger after that. They didn't argue or press further. They just exchanged a glance between them, the kind men use when realizing the odds aren't what they thought, then offered a half-hearted nod and stepped off the porch. The door shut behind them with a quiet finality, and the tension in the room eased like a storm passing in reverse. No one said anything for a moment. The younger woman let out a breath she'd been holding so long it had become part of her. The older one gave the rancher a look that wasn't gratitude exactly, something sturdier, more equal. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't made threats. But his presence had drawn a line those men wouldn't cross. He thought maybe that was enough. But then came a voice, small and bright behind him. A child. Are you gonna be our pa now? The question wasn't asked with pressure. Just wonder. Just hope. Spoken out loud like kids do before the world teaches them caution. He turned slowly, met the boy's gaze, and something inside him shifted. Something too quiet to name, but too strong to deny. He hadn't answered the women's question with words, but the boy had answered his. The decision had already been made. Days didn't change in big ways, but in the small ones that mattered. His boots stayed by the door now. His rifle leaned against the wall, not out of reach, but no longer clutched like a shield. He chopped wood without being asked, mended a fence without a word, and when supper was served, there was a place set for him like it had always been there. The women spoke freely now, not in caution but in rhythm, trust built not by promise, but by showing up. The children no longer watched him with questions in their eyes. They just asked what he'd do tomorrow. He'd come for one night, convinced he had nothing left to offer. But the land hadn't wanted a man full of answers. It had waited for one willing to stay. Without realizing it, he had.